Welcome back. Well, I told you in the last video that I was going to talk about the actual elk today. And so we're going to talk about the critter, but we're also going to talk about where he's to be found and a little bit about how to hunt him. And we're also going to address the issue also of whether to choose, a privately orchestrated hunt, just set up a personal hunt on your own, or whether you should seek out a outfitter. Now, I'm not going to recommend either one, but I'm going to present the various facts to you that you can use to make your assessment. So anyway, I think before I begin, though, I want to tell you a story that goes back to my youth. I was very young. I was only about 14 years old when my 9-year-old Chesapeake Bay Retriever, Sean, when he died. And so shortly afterwards, I had, a boy without a dog was no good. I had to have another dog. But I had been kind of interested in getting a dog that I was getting to that age now where I was starting to, mess around with the idea of hunting myself. And I wanted to be able to go out pheasant hunting and duck hunting and rabbit hunting and everything. I mean, I wanted to do it all. So my father was mostly a duck hunter, I think, more than anything else. But, so I wanted to be able to do it all. So I wanted to have an all-purpose dog. And there was something about the Springer Spaniel breed that really attracted my attention. For one thing, they were, I was, only a 14-year-old kid. So I figured, a cute Springer Spaniel would be just up my alley. So we went down to Duxbury, Massachusetts, and got a nice Springer from really pure hunting stock. Duxbury is an area where it's teeming with wildlife back in the '60s. So it probably still is too. I don't know, but it's certainly a different place now than it was then, I'm sure. But so we brought her home, and I started training her immediately when she was 8 weeks old, dragging a piece of bologna around the backyard with a string so she could track it down. I'd let her out of the house, and she'd find it. And then we graduated to some pigeon feathers, a couple of wings that I bundled together, and so I dragged that around. She'd locate the pigeon, and she was happy I discovered quickly that she was happy just to find it. I didn't have to reward her with anything. She was just happy to oblige and find the pigeon feathers. So anyway, that went very well. Then I acquired a friend of ours had shot a pheasant, and he gave me the wings from the pheasant, and so we graduated to pheasant, and I taught her to track those. Well, she was absolutely magical on pheasant. I think she could manufacture pheasant where they weren't even existing. And I on a couple of occasions, she went right through the same area that another guy had gone through with his Labrador Retriever or German pointers, and she'd find a pheasant underneath a bush someplace that they had gone by. So she was very, very intelligent dog. Kind of like Benny in many ways, the different sort of breed, but very, very biddable, and she loved me. Well, I did pretty well hunting pheasant with her, and we'd go out with my dad's old 16 gauge Ithaca Model 37 pump, and I'd usually come home with at least one, sometimes my limit of 2 pheasant and cock pheasant. And so my first cousin's husband found out about this, and so he wanted to go out hunting with me. Of course, he wanted to go hunting where I hunted. I wasn't that stupid, that I'm not going to show anybody my local fishing hole, and I'm not going to show him where I find my pheasants. So anyway, he picked up on the notion that I wasn't gonna reveal my secrets. So he said, "Well, let's go down to Fort Devens, and I'll pick you up, and we'll go down there." Well, naturally he didn't have a dog, so he wanted to have a dog, and I think that was the big attraction. Whether he needed me along, I don't know, but he wanted the dog. So it was about an hour and a half drive down there. So I'd get up in the middle of the night, he'd pick me up and would drive and drive and drive, and would get there 45 minutes before the gate opened. It was part of the culture. Everybody had to get there ahead of time and stand around their cars, and have a couple of cigarettes and coffee and all that. And we're talking about 50, 60, 100 people all out here alongside the back gate at Fort Devens, which was the U.S. Army Special Forces Green Beret Training Center. And everybody's waiting for 45 minutes to an hour for the sergeant to open the back gate up and blow the whistle. Well, you can just imagine when everybody piles up to this fence and waits for that gate to open, the sergeant blows the whistle ceremoniously, and everybody goes running in there, literally running, and shotguns blazing, and poor pheasants didn't have a chance. And some of these pheasants, got loaded up with 5 and 6, rounds of 12-gauge shotguns. And so whatever pheasants survived, were so far away that nobody would ever find them again. They were flying down to Cape Cod or something. Well, things went pretty dim. I never got a pheasant down there that I can recall, and I think we probably made 3 or 4 visits each year for 2 years, and but I got my pheasants because I knew where to go. Well, there's kind of a moral to the story here. My cousin, was relying on just the only thing he knew was to go to public lands and to hunt pheasant. He didn't know where to find them on his own, so he couldn't. Unlike me, I was hunting with local lore. I knew where to find him because I had, being a kid out in the fields and everything, I knew where the pheasants were, so I could simply go right back there. And that was no issue for me. But see, he didn't know the local lay of the land. They had moved in from out of town and everything. So that's one thing, is that, locals always have the great advantage when it comes to hunting because they know the lay of the land. They know the movement of the game. They've been out there all their lives. And so they have a tremendous advantage in that regard. The second moral of the story is they're not going to tell you. They're not going to tell an invader, somebody who's not native to the area or somebody they don't know, where the game is to be found. As a matter of fact, they're probably not even going to tell their friends. So that's just the way hunting and fishing goes. Well, so I think the important thing to remember is that when you're hunting in a strange area, someplace that you're not native to, you're going to have that distinct liability. Let's talk about the elk himself. The elk ranges right now in 31 of our 48 lower states, and I think there's a few in Alaska. But in between the 1600s and the late 1800s, they were largely extirpated from most states in the country. The Merriam's elk was killed off to extinction. The Merriam elk, which was found in Texas and New Mexico, and I think maybe some in Arizona, those just were simply exterminated. The Thule elk still lives in California and perhaps some other places. Roosevelt elk, which is the largest of the American elk, they live, it's a large population, probably half the population of Oregon is Roosevelt elk. And they also have the Rocky Mountain elk. But most of the elk population that I would say that the large majority of Americans seek is probably down through the Rocky Mountains, and Colorado makes up the largest of all the elk populations, probably more than double any out of the state, at 290,000 estimated herd. Well, those states where elk reside, they're wild. I mean, elk are a wild animal that lives in some of the wildest country in America, secluded from the rest of human population. And, while they may be found, occasionally they'll roam into somebody's barnyard and things like that. you're not going to. It's not of any benefit to somebody who's hunting from out of state to know that sort of thing. You know, the local kids will shoot their, and the local farmers will shoot their elk when they come onto their property, onto their ranches and things. But those are hideaways that you're not going to know about. The elk is a ruminant. In other words, he has a four-chambered stomach, and his life is much like a cow rather than moose or deer. Moose and deer, you know, are browsers. They browse through the woods and they nip the buds off of young saplings and things like that. And the very small, you know, starter trees that are just coming up. They're just barely a green twig that's coming out of the ground. They'll eat those. And occasionally they'll go into grassy land, and they'll do in my backyard. They'll come into my backyard and they'll eat regular grass, but they're not ruminants like a elk is. So an elk, like a cow, has to have a place to go during the day to just basically lie down and to chew his cud and to digest the food that he's eaten in the morning. So they have a particular lifestyle that controls their comings and goings. Just like cows, you know, they'll feed in one area and they go ruminate someplace else. So they'll be moving early in the morning. They'll be moving down in the lowlands. You know, during the hunting season, they'll largely come down from the high country, from the woods very early in the morning, and they'll move about in the large alpine meadows or lower riverbeds and places like that, and that's where they'll browse. They'll graze, because they do graze. They'll also browse in the woods like a deer and a moose, but largely they'll graze. So they'll come down in the morning and they'll spend 2 or 3 hours or more grazing through those lowlands or the higher alpine meadows. When I say alpine meadows, I'm talking about places which are vast expanses of grasslands, and there might be some juniper, you know, because it's sunny and all those places. But that's where they'll be found during the day, or as I say, down in the lower riverbeds and the valleys. And later on, sometime around midday, they'll wander off. They might spend 2 hours wandering off to where their rumination spot is, just grazing along the way. And they'll lie down and they'll stay there for 2 or 3 hours or more before they start heading back up into the hills. They're a herd animal. They especially as it starts coming into breeding season, rutting season, they gather together more, and also for protection, because the cows are very vulnerable to predation, so they seek the company of the males. The males are certainly seeking the company of the females because they're coming into rut around August or so, and the courtship behavior starts during that time. And the herds also start, gathering in size. So, various herds will get together and they'll form, larger single herds. So, those herds can grow, 300 to 400 strong, and that's not unusual. Sometimes you'll have herds that be as small as, during that season, you'll have herds that are as small as, 12 or a couple of dozen or something. But a lot of times they're large herds, and they band together for protection from predators a lot. Now, in those herds, and outside of those herds, you'll have individual large bulls. Bachelor bulls, some people call them, and these bachelor bulls are basically they're exiled from the herd. They're usually quite aggressive. They're trying to seek favor of a cow, but because of the hierarchical situation in a herd, there are already dominant bulls that they have their own harem, and there's no trespassing allowed. So those dominant bulls will maintain custody of their own harem of up to 20 cows per bull, and they'll protect them. And if a cow decides to wander off, he's going to chase after her, and he'll usher her back into his own harem. And several of these harems, many of these harems will get together, and so they'll all travel together, kind of as a community. It's almost like a nomadic tribe. So those large bachelor bulls, they can be sizable. They can be some of your largest bulls out there, but they haven't managed to gain dominance over the bulls in the herd. So they can be found as satellites out around the herd, and they can range quite a ways. But they're never going to be that far from the herd, because these guys are in the rut. And they still want to get into that herd every now and then and try their luck and see if they can maybe battle their way into a sexual encounter. Usually it doesn't go very well for them. The dominant bulls will usually they'll spar, and it doesn't necessarily go. Sometimes it's just more of a sporting spar where two bachelor bulls will get together and they'll just, it's something, they're jousting, and it's nothing serious. But when an outsider comes into that herd that's not wanted, that can be a mortal combat thing where they're going to fight to the death sometimes, or until one of them finally runs off. But so out of the 290,000 elk that you might have in the state of Colorado, you can say that that's fractionalized. To find them is fractionalized by locating various herds throughout the state. And some of those herds are found in some of the wildest, most deep wilderness that you can possibly imagine, places that are not readily accessible. The type of country that they live in is tough no matter what. It's not usually infested with roads. It's back country that there may be some private roads throughout, some especially logging roads. But whenever you're talking about logging roads, access roads, you're talking about private land, and private land is in the West is usually controlled and usually restricted. Farm country and ranch country is greatly protected. Most ranchers take a dim view of having strangers come on their property and possibly starting a fire. Or harassing their own livestock and things like that. Driving over their roads and blocking tractor paths and places that they have to get. They don't like to have intruders, and you can certainly understand that. It's not uncommon for ranchers to have 40, 50,000 acres of their own under their own control. And oftentimes you wouldn't even know where their house is to begin with. Their house may or may not even be, on that land. It may be greatly remote from the property. But it'll oftentimes be. Usually it's gated. There's a fence around it. There's a wire fence around it. It's gated, and you're not welcome to trespass on it. They'll usually have a cow gate, which is it's open, and there are railroad tracks across it that it's open underneath, so the cows can't walk across it. It only allows human traffic. But you're not to be found inside there if you're not welcome. If it says no trespassing, that's it. You can't go in there. So there's largely no hunting on private land unless you have exclusive permission. And throughout most of the states in the West, that's gonna be that way. Many ranchers and many farmers will, they'll curry favor with outfitters who are willing to pay them to lease hunting rights up on their land. And that's, it's certainly profitable for them to do that, because it's a good way for them to earn an income during the hunting season is to have outfitters, maintain leased rights to their property. So, and outfitters, it's a handshaking process. The outfitters need to have that sort of property to lease so that they have some place to hunt. So that makes it very favorable for the outfitter. Outfitters also can go on BLM property. Now they don't have exclusive rights to BLM property, Bureau of Land Management property, which is run by the government out west. Most BLM property is out west. But they certainly, being registered guides and outfitters, they know those places like the back of their hands, and they know the movement of the game. They know where the game is found, and not all BLM property has game. It's as simple as that, And elk are not nailed down by the hoof, so they can move along, and they can show up any place and leave another one. So they're, as I say, they're nomadic, and just a little bit of hunting pressure will just send them scurrying, and they're not going to come back until the end of the season. Perhaps they'll never be seen again in that area for months. So outfitters usually have great. I'm talking about. As I say, I'm not trying to promote the idea of going to an outfitter because they are extremely expensive. I'm just trying to bring down to earth the reality of what you're dealing with when you go off on a self-directed hunt. What you're going to be facing. So yes, you can seek out your U.S. Geodetic Survey maps. And by the way, the maps that you used to buy at the hardware store and the general store that were all rolled up, and you could go to the general map and see which one you wanted and say, I want map number 41 or something. Those maps are pretty much gone by the wayside. I would say that the 3 or 4 stores that I knew that carried them 20 years ago are no longer stocking. Whatever they have left in stock is all they have to sell now, and most of them have turned yellow and they're throwing them away or they're outdated. Because the U.S. Geodetic Survey is now largely something you go to your own computer and go to their store, and you can print out the map that you want right on your own computer, because you're only going to get it unless you have access to a big map size printer. You're going to get a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that doesn't have the resolution and the type of topography detail that you'll get on one of the larger traditional maps. People now are largely going to naturally the electronic way of hunting. Using GPS maps and things like that, HuntX, all these different things these different apps that you can buy. That's what people are using now to find their hunting spots. It's both good and bad, and you can use Google Earth and things like that. But there's still, the old USGS maps were the sort of thing that you could fold them up and stick them inside your vest pocket, and you can pull them out during the day, and you could see the lay of the land on a greater scale than what you can do on your little phone. And you could see, for instance, where game might go from one place to another because of a valley between 2 hills and stuff like that. That's been greatly limited by the fact that you have to do it on a phone now, or on some sort of small GPS device. Those devices they're fantastic for finding your own way around and navigating, but they leave a lot to be desired when it comes to actually finding good hunting spots the way the old traditional maps were, because you could see the great lay of the land all around and get the topography. But out west, you're talking about a particular problem of access. Much of the BLM properties, and you have to pretty much figure that you're going to be, unless you have inside contact with somebody who lives out west that will give you permission to hunt on their land, you're pretty much restricted to hunting BLM property, because you're probably not going to be able to find anybody who's willing to allow you to hunt on their land. it's just very low feasibility. So if you're hunting BLM property, a lot of it is checkerboarded throughout the West. In other words, there's intersecting corners. You know, think of a checkerboard, the squares. You know, all the black squares meet at the corners, and all the white squares meet at the opposite two corners. It's actually illegal to go from corner to corner. In other words, you can't go from black square to black square. That's actually illegal. So, and people who have, you know, electronic devices and maps have sometimes try to go across those corners. And, you know, that can be very difficult because these days, you know, the ranchers and the farmers will post those corners and they'll say no trespassing. And these days, you know, they can have cameras up there and everything, and they can see who's violating that. So the big issue is access to BLM property. A lot of people think that, you know, there's some sort of guaranteed access to all BLM property, but that's not necessarily true, and that's largely not true. A lot of it is surrounded by private land, and there's no guaranteed access through that private land. You know, there's some people have this mistaken notion that because of BLM property over through this guy's land, that you know, he's got to have some right of way through his property to get to it, and that's not true at all. It's basically unused land that nobody can use except the U.S. government, and so. And of course, that's raised all sorts of issues in modern years. But you'll have BLM property which is accessible to the public, and the locals all know where that is. You know, you're swimming upstream right immediately because the locals know already which of those parcels of land are productive, and they're going to be lined up there like they are at Fort Devens early in the morning back in those days, and they're all going to be the first ones to get in there, and they know where they're going when they are going in there, and it's one of those things where without local knowledge, you basically it's just really it's by luck. I don't know if there's any statistics on the success rate for, you know, hunting on BLM property. It's certainly not as high as it is for hunting on leased land with outfitters that have access to private land, and they have absolute deeded rights to use that property without anybody else intruding. And there's also the fact that, you know, the guides get to work that land and to find out, you know, the movement of the game. That's their business. That's what they earn their living doing, and the outfitters pay them well to do that. So they, you know, and usually at any outfitting camp, there's very often, you know, if you have 8 or 10 guides or more. There'll usually be some sort of pool, and whichever hunter gets the largest head of game, the guide gets a half of the share of the winnings of that pool. So it's something that they work very hard. It's a competitive thing. So when you go out with a guide, that guy's working as hard as he possibly can because he knows that there might be $1,000 in it for him if he can find a really nice head of, you know, a nice elk for you. So it's a very competitive thing, and you have a lot going for you when you're going on an outfitted hunt. Of course, what you don't have going for you is, it costs an awful lot of money. You're spending fantastic amounts of money. You're paying right up front. You're paying $700 or more for your game tag. Sometimes there's conservation stamps that you have to buy. There's all sorts of incidental fees that sometimes can raise that price tag to $1,000 before you even start out. Some states have different requirements when it comes to, you know, what sort of land you can hunt on, when you can hunt on it. You have to know your seasons for your various zones, and also game has a tendency to move in ways contrary to the way you might be allocated. The hunting pressure in one day can move animals across a state highway which divides two zones, and all the animals. You can just sit there and watch all the animals that are in a zone that you're not allowed to hunt in because it's out of season, while you're hunting on land that's completely devoid of game. And that's just the way it goes. And that can even occur with an outfitted hunt. But with an outfitted hunt, the outfitter knows he usually has access to other areas, so that if one goes dry on him, he can immediately send his people to another zone, maybe 40 or 50 miles away, and they can hunt that successfully. So the rate of success for an outfitted guided hunt is usually very close to 100%. When it's below 100%, it's usually because of hunters just absolutely they're poor shots, or they're not able to keep up with the guide. And let me talk a little bit about that. A good guide will not lead you around. I think that's a great misconception. A great guide will not stay, he does not walk point for you, and he does not, say, come this way, and as you follow along behind him, dogging behind him. That is not the way a good guide will work. A good guide will, he'll suggest to you in the morning, we can either go up this way, and this sort of situation might occur, or sometimes the elk are over here because they'll come down in the morning on this side of the mountain. So they'll leave you options, and you go there, and the guide is there with you, but he's not. Usually he's following behind you. I told you that they don't wear camo. Well, for the most part, they don't. One of the things they don't have to worry about camo is because they're not going to be seen, because you're the one who's walking point. So I think it's a terrible travesty if you have a guide that is doing all the leading while you're following him, and those are the people who usually will not get their game, because the guide is going to see the game, and sometimes the game will see him before he sees the hunter, and then that's the end of it. So there's nothing to shoot. So, but always remember, a good guided hunt with a good outfitter, you do the hunting. They're not hunting for you. They just simply they guide. That's what the term is. They guide you so that you have some idea where you're going. They'll drive to the spot that you would have driven by, because they know that behind that hill over there, that's where there's a rumination area during the day. So they know that the elk are going to be moving from point C to point E and all that stuff. They know the various ways that the elk will move. If they're not moving from point A to C today, they might be moving from point J to F. So it's one of those things that they will know because of their experience in the area. So never discount that. But if you're on your own, if you're determined to go out there on your own, just be aware that you have to do a lot of investigation. Try to be mindful that you're not going to get much help. When you arrive out there, you can ask the local general store owner, or the hardware store owner or something, or restaurateur. You can ask him about the hunting around the area. He's probably not going to he's either not going to know, or he's not going to care, or he's probably, if anything, maybe his son is out there hunting that day, and he's not going to tell you where his son's going hunting. So, you're not going to have too many things working for you in that regard. You're hunting essentially blindfolded. And elk being what they are, remember that, in a herd of 290,000 elk in Colorado, that's broken up into, a number of herds, which greatly fractionalizes that. And when you think that some of that stuff is out in Estes Park, way, up in some of the most rugged country you can possibly get into, up to 14,000 feet and things like that, people are not hunting up there. You can't breathe up there. So, and it's very inaccessible. You just can't walk off the road and think that you're going to go, a mile in and get your elk, because that brings up a very, very difficult logistical problem. If you have access to a particular type of country that, John A. Cleveland certainly does. He knows that country like the back of his hand, because he's been hunting it for 40 years. If you have access to something like that, where you can get in and out, and you know where you're going to be likely, trucking your game out on your back, That's all well and good, and that's a fun way to hunt. There's a lot of hard work, but that's a fun way to hunt if you know where you are and how it's going to go and how to negotiate your game in and out. But if you're hunting in wild land and you happen to put an elk down just 1,000 yards away, 300 yards away, wherever you put it down, if you put an elk down, you've got a bull elk that weighs 900, 1,000, maybe almost 1,100 pounds that you're dealing with. To get them dressed out, is a two-man job. I mean, you just simply don't, wade into a 1,000-pound bull elk the way that you do with a deer. You got to crawl inside that critter, and it's big work. Usually, with my elk, I had to take his hind leg and I had to crane it back like I was switching a railroad track. And I had to hold that thing up on my shoulder as hard as I possibly could. I thought I was going to break my collarbone. I had to hold it on my shoulder while the guide, opened him up and everything, because we couldn't roll him on his back. He was in a hole. So there's those complications to deal with. And then when you quarter them out, you're dealing with massive amount of weight. The antlers on an elk weigh up to 40 pounds on a Roosevelt elk, and they certainly can weigh 35 pounds on a standard run-of-the-mill 6x6. So that alone, and their hide is very heavy. Out of 1,000 pounds of bull elk, you're gonna actually dress out about 300 or so pounds of boned out meat. So even if you manage to break it down into just the boned out meat, that's a lot of weight to take out. You're talking about the weight of a typical black bear in New England, just the weight of the meat alone. So it's a massive critter to deal with. On a guided hunt, the guides have access to equipment to get that out. They'll have permission to go on the land with a Polaris or maybe a mule or a tractor or something like that. They have some way of negotiating that animal out whole in its entirety without having to quarter it. Or if you're going on a horseback hunt, they'll pack it out with mules. So they have all that at their disposal, something that you can't do by yourself. You're not going to be flying in from Alabama and bringing your horses and mules with you. It's not going to happen. So you're basically on your own 2 feet. So that's the way things are in the real world. And if you're interested in elk hunting, you really have to study your options and understand how much you're willing to lay out to do this, and understand that elk are they're not like deer. Deer, you can pretty much stop in at any corner of New Hampshire or Vermont or whatever, as long as there's no houses around and there's no trespassing signs around. You just wander in and you got as good a chance of getting a deer as the next guy. And that's not true with elk. Elk they're not solitary creatures like that by and large, except for those, bachelor bulls that run around the herd, the satellite, bulls that run around the herd. They're pretty much attached to that herd. They stay close by, within a half a mile of that herd or so. But for the most part, you're looking for a herd animal that is in clusters in various places throughout a state. And sometimes, here's my buddy. Oh, he's got a cookie with him too. Hi, you got a big, can I see? Oh, that's a big one. Good boy. He loves to come down and show me that. So that's the logistical end of it. The next video I want to talk about, I'll get it down to almost to the last episode. The last episode I'm going to save for the best, which is which cartridge. I know you're all wondering what cartridges I prefer. What's the best rifle to go out there with? But before that, I've got something else I want to talk to you about first. So anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about us, and God bless.